A millionaire returns home exhausted after a day of work when, while parking in the garage, a little beggar girl emerges from the shadows and whispers, "Don't go in, sir. They're waiting for you inside." Before he can question how that girl managed to get into his garage, a deafening crash echoes from inside the mansion, confirming that there are intruders inside the house. His heart races, and what happens in the next few minutes is terrifying. The yellowed envelope trembled in Helen's fingers as she held it up to the window's light. At 72, her hands weren't as steady as they once were, but at that moment, it wasn't age that made them tremble. It was the fear of what she might find inside the letter, discovered by chance, hidden at the bottom of her late sister Alice's drawer. The discovery had happened only an hour earlier. When Helen finally mustered the courage to organize the belongings Alice had left at her house. 3 months had passed since her younger sister had moved to Maplewood assisted living, and Helen knew it was time to undertake that painful task. Alice had always been reserved, but finding a sealed letter addressed to herself in her sister's unmistakable handwriting was like unearthing buried treasure. "To Helen, my dear sister. When I'm no longer here to explain," the envelope read in careful script, despite the tremors that had afflicted Alice in recent years. The words danced before Helen's eyes. She had to put on her reading glasses to make sure she wasn't dreaming. She sank into the living room's favorite armchair, the one where she used to knit on Sunday afternoons. The house, which she had shared with Alice her entire life, now seemed to echo with silence. The two sisters had never married, dedicating their lives to each other and to the nieces and nephews who visited occasionally. Helen had always thought she knew all of Alice's secrets, just as Alice knew hers. But this letter suggested otherwise. Helen closed her eyes and tried to recall any time Alice might have hinted at keeping something important. Her sister had always been the more dreamy of the two, the one who made up wild fairy tales as a child, and who, even as an adult, had a special sparkle in her eye when she spoke of the past. But Helen had always attributed that to Alice's naturally romantic personality. Now, with that letter in her hands, Helen began to question if she truly knew her sister as well as she thought. The wall clock ticked past 3 o'clock on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in March. Helen had planned to spend the day organizing Alice's things and perhaps visiting some neighbors she hadn't seen in a while. Simple plans for a simple afternoon. But the letter's discovery changed everything. She turned the envelope over once more, noting that the seal was intact. Alice had carefully sealed the letter, even using red wax, something Helen hadn't seen in decades. Her sister had always been meticulous with details, but this seemed excessive even for her. "What were you hiding, Alice?" Helen whispered to the silent room. The question hung in the air, mixing with the distant chirping of birds in the backyard and the soft rustle of wind in the leaves of the old oak tree the two had planted together over 40 years ago. Everything in the house breathed shared memories, moments of camaraderie and confidences. Or so Helen had always believed. Helen rose from the armchair and walked to the window, observing the quiet street where she had lived her entire life. The familiar houses, the usual neighbors, the predictable routine that comforted her. But at that moment, everything seemed different, as if a veil had been lifted from her eyes. She returned to the armchair, placed the letter on the coffee table, and stared at it for long minutes. Part of her wanted to tear open the envelope immediately and discover what Alice had to say. Another part feared the contents might forever alter the image she held of her dear sister. Helen took a deep breath, reached for the letter, and just as her fingers brushed the paper, the telephone rang shrilly, making her jump in her seat. On the other end of the line, an unfamiliar voice asked, "Is this Helen Carter, Alice's sister?" Helen gripped the phone tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice on the other end was male, polite, but carried an urgency that made her even more nervous. "Yes, this is she," she replied, trying to control the tremor in her voice. "Who is this?" "My name is Edward Hayes. I'm an attorney, and I urgently need to speak with you about a matter concerning your sister, Alice. May I visit you today?" Helen glanced at the letter on the table, as if it might provide the answers she sought. "What kind of matter, Mr. Hayes? My sister has been at Maplewood Assisted Living for months, and she never mentioned an attorney. I prefer to explain in person, if you don't mind. It's a delicate matter, involving important documents she entrusted to me some years ago." Helen's mind began to reel. Important documents. Alice had never mentioned anything about attorneys or special papers. The two of them had always handled their paperwork together, from simple wills to the house deed. "Are you still there?" Mr. Hayes asked after a few seconds of silence. "Yes, I am. Mr. Hayes, it's very strange. Alice and I always talked about everything. I don't understand why she wouldn't tell me about this. I perfectly understand your surprise, Mrs. Carter. Can I be there in an hour? I live right downtown. It's not far." Helen hesitated. Welcoming strangers into her home wasn't something she usually did, especially after discovering she might not have known her sister as well as she thought. But curiosity was outweighing caution. "All right, Mr. Hayes. It's 247 Elm Street. The yellow house with the green gate." After hanging up the phone, Helen stood in the middle of the living room, looking alternately at the letter and the phone. Two surprises in a single afternoon were too much for her already weary heart. She walked to the kitchen and brewed some chamomile tea, trying to calm her nerves. While waiting for the water to boil, her mind wandered through childhood memories with Alice. They were only 2 years apart. But Helen had always felt like the responsible older sister. Alice was the dreamer, always making up stories about charming princes and faraway lands. Helen was the practical one, the one who handled the bills and household chores. When their parents died over 20 years ago, the two had leaned on each other and decided they didn't need anyone else. They had each other, and that had always been enough. Or at least that's what Helen believed. The tea was ready when she heard the gate creak. Through the kitchen window, she saw a man in his 50s, graying at the temples, wearing a discreet suit. He carried a brown leather briefcase and looked nervous. Helen opened the door before he even had a chance to knock. "Mr. Hayes." "That's right. Thank you so much for having me, Mrs. Carter." He smiled, but Helen noticed the smile didn't reach his eyes. "May I come in?" She led him to the living room. Offering the tea she had just brewed, Mr. Hayes accepted politely, but Helen noticed his hands also trembled slightly as he held the cup. "Mrs. Carter, first and foremost, I must tell you that your sister Alice is a very special woman. For the past 5 years, she has been a very cherished client." 5 years? Helen nearly dropped her own cup. "But Mr. Hayes, that's impossible. Alice hasn't left the house alone in the last 5 years. I accompanied her everywhere." Mr. Hayes lowered his gaze and sighed deeply. "Mrs. Carter, I'm afraid your sister was more independent than you might imagine. She first came to me in 2020, right after the pandemic. She said she needed to resolve some unresolved matters from her youth." Unresolved matters. Helen felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. "What matters?" The attorney opened his briefcase and took out a series of documents. "Your sister hired me to find someone very important to her, whom she had lost track of over 50 years ago." Helen fell silent, processing the information. 50 years ago, she and Alice were young, full of dreams and possibilities. But Helen couldn't recall anyone important who had disappeared from Alice's life back then. Who, Mr. Hayes? Who did she want to find? Mr. Hayes looked directly into Helen's eyes before answering. A man named Michael Anderson and Mrs. Carter. We found him. The name echoed in Helen's mind like distant thunder. Michael Anderson. She knew that name, she was certain of it, but it was like trying to grasp a dream that slips away upon waking. The memory was there, somewhere in the depths of her mind, but it refused to surface. Michael Anderson, she repeated softly, savoring each syllable. I know that name, Mr. Hayes, but I can't place it. Mr. Hayes leaned forward, observing Helen's expression intently. Alice said you might not remember him. Apparently, she made a point of keeping this relationship a secret, even from her own sister. Helen felt a sharp pang in her chest. In all her life, she had never imagined Alice could have such deep secrets. They shared everything: dreams, fears, joys, disappointments. How was it possible that such an important man had existed in her sister's life without her knowing? Tell me about him, Mr. Hayes. Who is this Michael? The attorney consulted his papers before responding. Michael Anderson is 74, a widower, and lives in Charleston, South Carolina. For years, he worked as a naval engineer, but he's retired now. According to the information we gathered, he and Alice met in 1973, when they were both young. 1973, Helen murmured, doing a mental calculation. Alice was only 22. I was 24. She closed her eyes, trying to sift through the memories of that period. We were still living with our parents. Alice worked at the municipal library, and I taught at the neighborhood elementary school. Exactly. According to what Alice told me, they met at the library. Michael was in town temporarily, working on a project at the port. They fell in love. The attorney's words hit Helen like a punch to the gut. Alice in love. Her sister had always been discreet about relationships, but Helen had always assumed that, like herself, Alice simply hadn't found the right person. She had never imagined there was a hidden love story in her past. But what happened to them? Why did they break up? Mr. Hayes sighed and lowered his gaze. That part of the story is more complicated, Mrs. Carter. Michael had to return to Charleston for work and promised to come back for Alice once he was settled. They exchanged letters for a few months, but then what? Mr. Hayes. The letters stopped coming. Michael tried to call, but he could never reach Alice. According to him, someone always answered and said she wasn't there or couldn't come to the phone. After a while, he gave up, thinking she had lost interest. Helen felt her blood run cold. Someone who answered the phone and said Alice couldn't come to the phone. In 1973, only 3 people lived in that house: her, Alice, and their mother. And their mother rarely answered the phone, leaving that task to Helen. "Oh my God," she whispered, hand to her chest. "I remember now. There was a young man who called relentlessly for Alice. Mama said he wasn't good company, that he was from out of town and would only bring trouble. She asked me to intercept his calls. You remember him?" Helen closed her eyes, and the images began to return like faded photographs. He was tall, dark-haired, always very well dressed. He showed up at the house a few times, but Mama never let him in. She said men from out of town were no good, that they just wanted to take advantage of naive girls. The memory grew clearer with each passing second. Helen recalled how Alice had grown sad in those months, how her younger sister had lost the sparkle in her eye and become more reserved. At the time, Helen had attributed the change in mood to the pressure of working at the library. "Mr. Hayes, I did a terrible thing," Helen admitted, tears starting to well up in her eyes. "I really did intercept the calls. When he asked for Alice, I'd say she was out or didn't want to talk. I thought I was protecting my sister, following Mama's advice. Mr. Hayes reached out and gently touched Helen's arm. "Mrs. Carter, you were young and trying to look out for your family. You couldn't have known the consequences of your actions. But I destroyed the love of Alice's life." Tears now flowed freely down Helen's face. All these years, she kept this secret, this pain, and I had no idea. That's why she never married. Why she always had that distant look when we talked about relationships. The attorney waited patiently for Helen to compose herself before continuing. "Mrs. Carter, there's one more thing I need to tell you. Michael never forgot Alice. When we managed to locate him, he was deeply moved to learn that she still thought of him. He would very much like to see her again." Helen wiped her eyes and looked directly at Mr. Hayes. He still has feelings for her. In his own words, Alice was the great love of his life. He married some years later, had a happy family, but he always kept a special place in his heart for her. Now that he's widowed, he said he'd like to at least talk to her, explain what happened. Helen felt a mix of hope and apprehension. Could it be possible that, after all this time, there was still a chance for happiness for Alice? "Mr. Hayes, where exactly is this Michael now?" Mr. Hayes adjusted his glasses and consulted his documents again. "Michael is in Charleston, as I mentioned, but there's something else, Mrs. Carter. He doesn't know Alice is at Maplewood Assisted Living. When we located him, your sister specifically asked that we not reveal her current condition." Helen felt her heart clench. Alice had always been proud, and she certainly wouldn't want Michael to see her in her current fragile state. She doesn't want him to know about the dementia. Exactly. Alice told me she preferred that he keep his memories of her as a vibrant young woman. That's why she asked me to find him, but not to establish direct contact. So what was her plan? The attorney hesitated for a moment before answering. She just wanted to know if he was well, if he had been happy in life. Alice told me that would be enough to bring peace to her heart. Helen rose from the armchair and walked to the window, observing the garden she and Alice had tended together for decades. The flowers were starting to wilt without her sister's attentive care. Everything in the house seemed to reflect Alice's absence. "Mr. Hayes, you said Michael would like to see her again. Does he know she looked for him?" "Yes, I told him about Alice's search. He was deeply moved. In fact, Michael asked me to convey a message." Helen turned quickly. What message? Mr. Hayes opened his briefcase and took out a sealed envelope. He wrote a letter to her. He asked me to deliver it, if possible. Helen's hands trembled as she received the envelope. It was good quality paper, with Alice's name written in a firm, elegant hand. "He still writes letters." Michael told me he never stopped writing to Alice, even after they lost touch. All these years, he wrote letters he never sent, keeping them as a way to maintain their connection. Tears welled up in Helen's eyes again. The idea of Michael writing unsent letters for over 50 years was both romantic and heartbreaking. How many letters did he write? According to him, one a month. All these years, over 600 letters kept in a special box. Helen sat down again, holding the letter as if it were a fragile treasure. "Mr. Hayes, I have to do something. I can't let this story end like this. My sister deserves to know Michael never forgot her, and he deserves to know the truth about what happened. Mrs. Carter, I understand your feelings, but I must remind you that Alice was very specific about her wishes. She doesn't want Michael to see her in her current state, but she doesn't know he has 600 letters saved for her. She doesn't know he never stopped loving her either." Helen stood up again, this time with determination. "Mr. Hayes, where can I find Michael?" Mr. Hayes seemed surprised by the change in Helen's tone. "Mrs. Carter, what are you thinking of doing?" "I'm going to Charleston. I'm going to talk to Michael in person. He has a right to know the truth about what happened in 1973, and I have an obligation to tell him. But you can't make that decision alone. And Alice. What will she think? Helen walked to the table where she had left Alice's letter and held it along with Michael's letter. Perhaps it's time to read what my sister wrote to me. Perhaps she herself left instructions on what to do. Mr. Hayes watched in silence as Helen carefully opened the yellowed envelope. His eyes followed her every movement as she unfolded the handwritten pages. Helen read in silence for a few minutes, her expression gradually shifting from apprehension to surprise, then to a mix of sadness and determination. "What did she write?" the attorney asked gently. Helen looked up, her eyes now shining with a new resolve. "Alice knew I would find out about Michael. She knew I'd remember my part in their separation, and she forgives me. And what about seeing Michael again?" Helen carefully folded Alice's letter and tucked it into her chest. She wrote that if Michael truly still cares for her, if he truly never forgot her, then perhaps true love is stronger than pride or fear. Mr. Hayes leaned forward. "Does that mean—" "It means I'm going to Charleston tomorrow morning, but I'm not going alone." Helen looked directly at the attorney. "Mr. Hayes, will you come with me? Michael deserves to hear the truth from someone who was there. And I need someone who can help mediate this meeting." The attorney hesitated, clearly torn between his professional responsibility and the desire to help resolve that interrupted love story. "Mrs. Carter, this could have very intense emotional consequences for everyone involved." Helen smiled for the first time since this whole situation began. "Mr. Hayes, at 72, I've learned that the consequences of inaction are often far worse than those of trying to mend our mistakes." Mr. Hayes closed his briefcase and stood up. "Very well, Mrs. Carter. We'll go to Charleston." The trip to Charleston began early the next morning. Helen had spent a sleepless night, rereading Alice's letter and trying to commit every word to memory. Her sister had been wise to write those lines, anticipating exactly what Helen would feel upon discovering the truth. Mr. Hayes arrived promptly at 7 in the morning, driving a comfortable car that would make the nearly 2-hour journey easier. Helen had dressed with special care. Choosing the blue dress, Alice always said, brought out her eyes. She wasn't entirely sure why, but she felt she needed to look her best for this meeting. "Did you sleep well?" the attorney asked as he helped Helen into the car. I didn't get a wink of sleep," she admitted, settling her purse on her lap. "I keep wondering what I'll say to Michael, how I'll explain everything that happened." "Mrs. Carter, remember that the truth is what matters. Michael is an understanding man. When we spoke on the phone, he proved to be someone who values honesty above all else." As the car glided down the highway, Helen watched the landscape gradually change. It had been years since she'd left her hometown, and seeing new horizons brought a strange sense of freedom and adventure. At 72, she was embarking on the most important journey of her life. "Mr. Hayes, tell me more about Michael. How did he react when he learned Alice had looked for him?" Mr. Hayes kept his eyes on the road, but Helen noticed a soft smile on his face. "He cried, Mrs. Carter." A 74-year-old man cried like a child upon learning Alice had never forgotten him. He said he had always believed she had chosen not to respond to his attempts at contact. "And his family? Does he have children?" "He has 2 adult children and 4 grandchildren. His wife passed away 3 years ago after a 45-year marriage. According to Michael, it was a happy marriage, but he always knew a part of his heart belonged to Alice." Helen felt a pang of sadness, imagining Michael living all these years with an incomplete love in his heart. At the same time, she was grateful to know he had managed to build a family and find happiness. even while carrying that longing. Did he tell his children about Alice? It's interesting you ask that. Michael told me yes, that he always spoke to his children about the first great love of his life. His family knows of Alice's existence, and according to him, they're all curious to meet her. The thought that an entire family knew about her sister, while she herself was ignorant of the story, made Helen reflect on how many other secrets Alice might have kept. But it also reassured her to know that Michael had honored the memory of their relationship, keeping Alice alive in his heart and in his stories. Mr. Hayes, what if Michael gets angry when he learns I was the one who intercepted the calls? What if he can't forgive me? Mr. Hayes slowed as they entered a construction zone on the highway. Mrs. Carter, from what I gathered speaking with Michael, he's a man who understands life's complexities. He knows that families sometimes act thinking they're protecting their loved ones. Besides, you were young, living in a different era. I was young, yes, but I was old enough to know what I was doing. I saw how sad Alice became in those months. I saw how she lost the sparkle in her eye, but I chose to believe I was doing the right thing. And you truly believed it, didn't you? You followed your mother's advice, who surely thought she was protecting Alice from potential heartbreak. Helen sighed deeply. Mama was afraid of everything that came from outside our small town. She believed outsiders only brought trouble. We grew up hearing that, and I ended up internalizing that fear. They stopped at a gas station to fill up and grab a coffee. Helen took the opportunity to call Maplewood Assisted Living and check on Alice. The nurse said she had slept well and was calm, unaware that at that very moment her sister was traveling towards the man she had loved over 50 years ago. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Hayes said when they returned to the car, I need to let you know that Michael is very anxious for this meeting. He cancelled all his appointments for today and is waiting for us at home. How is he physically? Is he in good health? From what I could observe, he's in excellent shape for his age. He walks a lot, tends his garden, reads extensively. His mind is lucid and his demeanor is admirable. Helen felt a mix of relief and nervousness. It was comforting to know Michael was well, but it also made the contrast with Alice's current state even more painful. When they finally entered Charleston, Helen felt her heart quicken. The bustling streets, the scent of the ocean in the distance, the pulsating life of the port city. Everything was new and exciting. She imagined a young Alice at 22 walking those same streets, in love and full of dreams. We're almost there, Mr. Hayes announced, turning onto a quiet residential street. Michael lives in a simple but very well-kept house. He renovated it himself after he retired. Helen adjusted her hair in the rearview mirror and took a deep breath. In a few minutes, she would be face to face with the man who had loved her sister her entire life, the man whose happiness she had inadvertently destroyed so long ago. Mr. Hayes, she said, as the car pulled up to a white house with a blooming garden. Thank you for bringing me here. I know this is above and beyond your professional obligations. Mrs. Carter, sometimes life gives us the opportunity to mend broken stories. I couldn't pass up this chance. The front door opened before they even reached the gate, and Helen saw Michael Anderson for the first time in over 50 years. Michael Anderson stood in the doorway, and Helen felt as if time had stopped. Even after 5 decades, she recognized him immediately. His hair was now completely white, his face marked by the lines of time, but his eyes were still the same, kind, deep, carrying a melancholy she now perfectly understood. He wore a light blue shirt and dark trousers, was clean-shaven, and Helen noticed he had dressed especially for the meeting. In his hands, he held a small bouquet of white daisies. Michael, Helen whispered, feeling her legs tremble as she walked through the well-tended garden. Helen, he replied, and his voice was exactly as she remembered, deep, warm, with a faint southern lilt. "You look just the same. I mean, you look beautiful." Mr. Hayes stayed discreetly a few steps behind, allowing the two to greet each other. Michael extended the bouquet to Helen. "They're daisies, Alice's favorite flowers. I still remember that." Helen accepted the flowers with trembling hands. "She still loves daisies. Our garden is always full of them in spring." "Please, come in," Michael said, gesturing towards the house. "I've made some coffee and a cake. I hope you like them." The house was cozy and impeccably organized. The walls were decorated with family photographs, children, grandchildren, happy moments of a life well lived. But Helen noticed, in a special corner of the bookshelf, a black and white photograph of a smiling young woman. It was Alice at 22. "You kept a photo of her," Helen observed, touched. Michael followed her gaze and smiled sadly. "It's the only one I have. I took it secretly one day at the library. Alice was organizing books, and the afternoon sun lit up her face. She looked like an angel." Helen approached the photograph. It was her sister, but a version she had almost forgotten, young, radiant, her eyes sparkling with happiness. She was very beautiful back then. "She always was beautiful," Michael corrected gently, "and I'm sure she still is." They sat in the living room, where Michael had prepared a table with coffee, homemade cakes, and cookies. Helen noticed he had set out 3 cups, as if expecting Alice to appear at any moment. "Michael," Helen began, taking a deep breath, "I need to tell you the truth about what happened in 1973. Mr. Hayes told me you had something important to tell me," Michael replied, pouring the coffee with slightly trembling hands. "All these years, I've tried to understand why Alice stopped responding to my letters, why I could never reach her again." Helen picked up the cup, more for something to hold on to than from a desire for coffee. "The letters arrived, Michael. And you did reach her, yes. It's just, I was the one who answered the phone." Michael paused with the cup halfway to his mouth. "You. My mother believed men from out of town were no good. She convinced me you'd only bring Alice heartache. So, when you called, I'd say she was out or didn't want to talk." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael set the cup back on its saucer, his hands now visibly trembling. Helen saw a range of emotions pass across his face. Shock, pain, anger, understanding. "You intercepted our conversations for months," he said finally, his voice low but without aggression. "Yes. And I've hated myself for it every day since I remembered." Helen felt the tears start to stream down her face. "Michael, I was young and foolish. I thought I was protecting my sister, but I destroyed her happiness. I destroyed both your happiness." Michael rose and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where red roses bloomed abundantly. "Alice never knew about my calls." "No, she waited for your letters until they stopped coming. Then she thought you had given up on her, that you had found someone else. And I thought she had given up on me," Michael murmured, "that she had decided our love wasn't worth it." Mr. Hayes, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward. "Michael, there's one more thing Helen needs to tell you about Alice." Helen wiped her eyes and looked at Michael, who had turned from the window. "Alice is sick, Michael. She has dementia and is in assisted living. It was she who asked Mr. Hayes to find you, but she didn't want you to know about her condition." Michael slowly returned to his armchair, the weight of the revelation visible in his movements. "Dementia? How long?" "About a year. Sometimes she remembers everything clearly, other times she doesn't even recognize me. But you know what's strange? She always remembers you. Always." "How so?" Helen smiled through her tears. "On bad days. When she doesn't remember my name or where she is, she still whispers Michael when she's dreaming. She still asks if any letters have arrived for her. Michael covered his face with his hands and his shoulders began to shake. All those lost years. All those years we could have been happy together. Helen rose and hesitantly approached him. Michael, I know I have no right to ask, but can you forgive me? Can you forgive an old fool who thought she was doing the right thing? Michael looked up, and Helen saw that he, too, was crying. Helen, we were all young. Your mother was trying to protect Alice. You were obeying your mother. And I should have pushed harder. I should have come to get my answer in person. So you forgive me? Michael rose and, to Helen's surprise, embraced her warmly. There's nothing to forgive. What matters now is that I know the truth. And I know Alice never stopped loving me, just as I never stopped loving her. They separated, and Michael looked directly into Helen's eyes. Now I need to ask you an important question. Will you let me see her? Michael's question echoed in the room like a church bell. Helen felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders. She knew she was about to make a choice that could completely change the course of Alice's life. And Michael's too. Michael, Helen said carefully, you need to understand that Alice isn't the same person you knew. The dementia has transformed her. Sometimes she's lucid and loving, other times she's confused and frightened. I understand that, Michael replied, his voice firm but gentle. I cared for my wife during the last 2 years of her life, when she developed Alzheimer's. I know how cruel this disease can be. But I also know that love can cut through even the fogs of memory. Mr. Hayes leaned forward. Michael, Alice was very specific about not wanting you to see her in this state. She fears it might tarnish the memories you have of her. But these aren't just my memories, Michael countered with an intensity that surprised Helen. They're our memories, and I need to tell her I never stopped loving her, that I never forgot her. She deserves to know that. Helen walked to the photograph of young Alice and gazed at it for long moments. In her mind, she saw images of her sister in recent months. Moments of confusion alternating with instants of crystal clarity. She remembered how Alice still dressed carefully every morning, as if preparing to meet someone special. There's something you don't know, Helen said slowly, still with her back to the two men. Alice has a daily ritual at Maplewood. Every afternoon, she sits on the porch and watches the entrance, as if waiting for someone. When I ask what she's doing, she replies, I'm waiting for Michael. He promised he'd come for me. Michael gasped, hand to his chest. She still waits for me. Helen turned, eyes brimming with tears. Every day, Michael, every single day for the past 8 months since she's been at Maplewood. The silence that followed was profound and heavy with emotion. Mr. Hayes removed his glasses and nervously polished them, clearly touched by the revelation. Helen, Michael said, rising and walking to her, you're her sister, the person who loves her most in the world. If you say I should respect her wishes and not go, I won't. But if there's even a small chance, my presence could bring her a moment of happiness. Helen looked at this man who had loved her sister for over 5 decades, who had guarded her memories like a treasure, who had written over 600 unsent letters. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine love that transcended time and circumstance. Michael, may I ask you a personal question? Of course. Why did you never try to find Alice before? All these years, why didn't you hire a detective or an investigator? Michael sighed deeply and returned to his armchair. Because I respected her choice. When the letters stopped coming and my calls were never returned, I interpreted that as a clear message. She had decided to move on with her life without me. I didn't want to be the kind of man who persists when a woman makes it clear she doesn't want contact. But you kept her photograph all these years. Keeping a memory and bothering a person are two very different things. I loved her too much to cause her any discomfort. Helen felt her heart clench at the nobility of that man. She imagined how many times he must have fought against the urge to look for Alice, how many nights he spent wondering about her. "Mr. Hayes," Helen said decisively, "I need to know, legally. Can I make this decision for Alice?" "As her sister and legal guardian, yes, you have that authority. But I recommend we think very carefully about this." Helen walked to the window and observed Michael's garden. The red roses swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. And she remembered how Alice always said flowers were the silent language of love. She turned to Michael with a determination she hadn't felt in years. "Michael, I'm going to take you to see my sister, but with a few conditions." Michael's eyes lit up with a mix of hope and nervousness. "What conditions?" "First, if Alice doesn't recognize you or becomes agitated, you promise you'll leave without insisting. Second, you understand she may have moments of confusion and say things that don't make sense. Third, you promise that, no matter what happens, you'll hold on to only the best memories of this meeting." "I promise all of that," Michael replied without hesitation. Mr. Hayes stood up, clearly concerned. "Mrs. Carter, are you sure this is the right decision?" Helen looked once more at the photograph of young Alice, radiant and in love. "Mr. Hayes, my sister has spent 50 years waiting for this man. She's been sitting on a porch for 8 months, waiting for him to keep a promise. I think she's waited long enough." Michael approached Helen and took her hands. "Thank you. I don't know how to thank you for giving me this chance." "Don't thank me yet," Helen said with a nervous smile. "Let's see if I regret this decision once we're at Maplewood." Mr. Hayes closed his briefcase and sighed. "Well, then I suppose we're making another trip today. To Maplewood?" Helen nodded, feeling a mix of dread and excitement. "Yes, it's time to take Michael home." The journey back to Maplewood began early that afternoon. Michael had insisted on riding in the back seat, carrying a small bag he had quickly packed. Helen observed in the rearview mirror how he nervously checked the contents. The 600 unsent letters, carefully organized by date, some old photographs, and a small blue velvet case. "What's in that case?" Helen asked, curious. Michael smiled timidly. "A ring. I bought it for Alice in 1973, a few days before I left for Charleston. I planned to ask her to marry me when I came back for her." Mr. Hayes almost lost control of the steering wheel. "You kept an engagement ring for 50 years. I could never bring myself to get rid of it. It felt like giving up on her for good." Helen felt a lump in her throat. The depth of Michael's love for her sister was something she had never imagined possible. "Michael, you really intend to—" "I don't know what I intend," he admitted. "I just know I need to give her back everything I should have given her 5 decades ago. The letters, the ring, my love, even if she doesn't understand, even if she doesn't remember me." The rest of the trip passed in contemplative silence. Helen called Maplewood and spoke with the head nurse, Sister Lucia, explaining she would be bringing a special visitor for Alice. "Mrs. Carter, you know how agitated Alice gets with changes in routine," the nun warned. "I know, Sister Lucia, but please trust me, this visit could be very important for her." When they arrived at Maplewood, it was almost 5 o'clock. Helen knew Alice's routine. At 5 sharply, her sister would go to the porch for her daily vigil, waiting for Michael. It was the perfect moment, or the most terrible, for the surprise. The building was welcoming, surrounded by well-maintained gardens where some residents strolled with family members. Helen always felt sad visiting that place, but today there was something different in the air, an anticipation that made her heart quicken. She's on the porch," Sister Lucia informed them when they were greeted at the reception. "As always at 5 o'clock. Today, she's particularly agitated, asking repeatedly if any letters have arrived for her." Michael tightened his grip on his bag strap. "She still waits for letters. Every day. It's one of the few things that remains constant in her memory." Helen guided Michael and Mr. Hayes through the familiar corridors. Some residents greeted Helen warmly. She'd become a constant presence there. Others looked curiously at Michael, perhaps sensing something special in his tense and expectant posture. "Michael," Helen said, stopping before they reached the porch. "Remember what we talked about. If she doesn't recognize you, I know. I'll leave without causing a disturbance." Helen took a deep breath and turned the corner. There was Alice, sitting in her favorite chair, gazing fixedly at the entrance gate. At 70, she still maintained a delicate beauty, her white hair neatly combed, wearing the blue cardigan Helen had brought her the week before. Michael stopped immediately upon seeing her, his breathing becoming ragged. "My God," he whispered, "she's even more beautiful than I remembered." Alice was in profile to them, concentrated on her observation of the gate. Helen noticed she held something in her hands. It was one of Michael's old letters, yellowed with time, which she had asked to bring from home. "Alice," Helen called softly. Her sister turned, and her eyes lit up when she saw Helen. "Oh, dear. Did any letters come for me today?" "Not exactly a letter, Alice. But I brought something even better." Helen stepped back slightly, revealing Michael. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Alice looked at him. Frowning slightly, as if trying to organize scattered memories, Michael took a step forward, trembling visibly. "Hi, Alice." Her reaction was instant and unexpected. Alice dropped the letter, put her hands to her chest, and her eyes filled with tears. "Michael, is that really you, or am I dreaming again?" "It's me, my love. I've come to keep my promise." Alice tried to rise from her chair, but her trembling legs wouldn't support her. Michael quickly approached and knelt before her, holding her hands. "You took so long," she said, caressing his face with trembling fingers. I waited so long." "I know, my love. Forgive me for taking so long." Helen watched the scene with tears flowing freely down her face. Her sister was completely lucid, more lucid than she had been in months. It was as if Michael's presence had ignited a light in her confused mind. "You're so different," Alice said, tracing his white hair with her fingers. "But your eyes are the same, those kind eyes that made me fall in love at the library." "And you're even more beautiful," Michael replied, gently kissing her hands. Mr. Hayes watched discreetly from the hallway, clearly emotional about the scene. Other residents and staff had begun to gather at a distance, drawn by the emotional intensity of the moment. "Michael," Alice said suddenly, with an urgency in her voice. "Oh, did you receive my letters? I wrote you so many letters." Michael opened his bag and pulled out the carefully organized stack of yellowed letters. "No, my love, but I wrote letters to you, one for every month we were apart." Alice's eyes widened at the sight of the stack of correspondence. So many letters. 622 letters, Michael said tenderly, one for every month since 1973. They all begin with "My dearest Alice" and end with "You're Michael, who never stopped loving you." Alice began to cry, but it was a cry of joy mixed with deep sadness. All those lost years. "They weren't lost," Michael said, wiping her tears. "Every day I thought of you. Every letter I wrote, every night I looked at the stars, wondering if you were looking at the same ones. Nothing was lost. Everything brought me back to you." Helen approached and gently touched Michael's shoulder. "May I speak with you both for a moment?" Alice looked at her sister as if seeing her for the first time that afternoon. Helen, you brought Michael to me, didn't you? You always looked out for me. Helen's heart broke at the irony of those words, but she merely smiled and nodded. Yes, dear. I brought Michael to you. The next few hours were like a miracle Helen had never expected to witness. Alice remained lucid and present, conversing with Michael as if they were young again. Sister Lucia had allowed them to stay beyond normal visiting hours, recognizing the extraordinary nature of that encounter. Michael had pulled up a chair to sit beside Alice, and the two carefully thumbed through the old letters. Each opened envelope revealed memories from decades past. Feelings preserved on paper yellowed by time. "Read this one to me," Alice asked, pointing to a letter dated December 1985. Michael carefully unfolded the paper and began to read. "My dearest Alice, it snowed in Charleston today, and I remembered how you said you'd like to see snow someday. I walked along the beach thinking about what it would be like to share that moment with you. How happy you'd be to see the flakes dancing in the air." "I always wanted to see snow," Alice interrupted, smiling. "You remembered that after all these years." "I remembered every dream you shared with me, every small wish, every hope." Helen watched, fascinated, as Alice's memory seemed to be functioning perfectly. It was as if Michael's presence had reconnected lost circuits in her brain, bringing back the woman she was before the illness. Michael," Alice said suddenly, growing more serious, "tell me about your family. Did you get married, have children?" Michael hesitated, looking quickly at Helen. "Yes, I got married. I had 2 wonderful children." "And were you happy?" The question caught Michael off guard. He remained silent for a moment, considering how to answer honestly without hurting her feelings. "I was happy, yes. My wife was a good woman, and our children brought me much joy. But," he paused, holding Alice's hand, "I always felt that a part of me was incomplete, like a book with missing pages." Alice nodded with understanding. "I understand. I never married, never had children. Helen always said I was too demanding, that no man was good enough for me. But the truth is, no man was you." The words hit Michael like a wave. He brought his free hand to his chest, visibly emotional. "Alice, You don't need to say anything," she gently interrupted him. "We both made the choices we could with the information we had. You can't spend your whole life waiting for someone who apparently doesn't want to be found." Helen subtly moved away, walking to a nearby window. Alice's words echoed in her mind, each one a pang of remorse. Her sister had spent decades alone, refusing other relationships, harboring a hope that Helen had helped to destroy. Mr. Hayes approached her. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Carter?" "Guilty," Helen admitted, "seeing how much they love each other, how they never stopped loving each other. It's impossible not to imagine how different their lives would have been." "Mrs. Carter, you can't carry that weight. The important thing is that they're together now." "For how long, Mr. Hayes? Alice has dementia. She might not remember him tomorrow or next week. And then he'll have to relive the pain of loss once more." They were interrupted by a joyful laugh from the porch. Alice was laughing at something Michael had just told her, her eyes sparkling with a vivacity Helen hadn't seen in months. "You still tell the same terrible jokes," Alice said, playfully swatting his arm. "And you still laugh at them," Michael replied, clearly happy. "Michael," Alice said, becoming more serious, "I need to ask you something. Why did it take you so long to find me? Why didn't you come looking for me sooner?" Michael looked at Helen, who nodded encouragingly. It was time for the complete truth. "Alice, when I stopped receiving your letters and couldn't reach you by phone anymore, I interpreted that as a sign that you had changed your mind about us. I thought you had found someone else, or that your family had convinced you I wasn't the right choice. But I never changed my mind. I never stopped loving you. I know that now. Helen told me what really happened. Alice turned to look at her sister, confusion growing in her eyes. Helen? What does she have to do with this? Helen approached slowly, feeling that this was the moment to tell Alice the whole truth. Honey, I need to tell you something about Michael's calls, about why you two lost contact. Alice frowned, trying to process the information. What calls? Michael never called me. He did call Alice, many times, but I answered the phone and I said you were out or didn't want to talk. The silence that followed was tense. Alice looked alternately at Helen and Michael, trying to understand what she had just heard. You stopped him from talking to me. Helen nodded, tears beginning to stream. Mama said men from out of town only brought trouble. I thought I was protecting you. Alice's expression slowly changed. The confusion gave way to a deep sadness, then to something Helen recognized as anger. 50 years, Alice said softly. 50 years waiting, wondering why he had abandoned me. 50 years alone, when I could have been happy. Alice, please, forgive me. I was young and... Young! Alice's voice rose, attracting the attention of other residents. You were 24, Helen. Old enough to know you had no right to decide my life for me. Michael rose and tried to calm the situation. Alice, please. What matters is that we're together now. Together now? Alice laughed bitterly. Michael, I have dementia. Some days I don't even remember my own name. How are we going to be together? How are we going to make up for 50 lost years? The painful lucidity of those words silenced everyone. Helen realized her sister was not only lucid, but brutally aware of her own condition and the limitations it imposed. Michael, Alice said, as Michael knelt before her again, we can't recover the past, but we can cherish the present. Every moment we have together is precious. Lucid moment we have. Every conversation, every smile. Alice looked into his eyes for a long moment. Then, slowly, her expression softened. You really wrote me 600 letters? 622. A small, sad smile appeared on her face. Then I guess we have a lot to talk about. In the weeks that followed their reunion, a new routine settled into Maplewood assisted living. Michael began visiting Alice every day, always arriving promptly at 5 in the afternoon, the time she used to hold her solitary vigil on the porch. Helen observed with a mix of joy and apprehension how her sister blossomed with Michael's constant presence. On good days, Alice was radiant, talking about past memories and making simple plans for the next day. On difficult days, when confusion overtook her mind, Michael patiently remained by her side, holding her hand and reading the old letters aloud. How is she today? Helen asked Sister Lucia during one of her morning visits. Better than she's been in months, the nun replied with a smile. It's amazing how Mr. Anderson's presence has an almost medicinal effect on her, even on her most confused days. She calms down when he arrives. Helen nodded, but her heart was heavy. While it was wonderful to see Alice happy, she couldn't stop worrying about Michael. What if Alice's condition worsened? What if she stopped recognizing him completely? How would he handle a second loss? Later that afternoon, Helen found Michael on the porch, reading one of the letters to Alice, who listened attentively with her eyes closed and a gentle smile on her face. And then I thought about how beautiful it would be to grow old beside you, to see our hair turn white together, to tell our grandchildren stories about how we met at the library. Michael read in a soft voice. Our grandchildren, Alice murmured, opening her eyes. Sometimes I dream of them, beautiful children with your eyes and my smile. Michael paused his reading and looked at her with infinite tenderness. I dreamed of them too. Helen approached discreetly. How are you two doing today?" "Oh, Helen," Alice said, turning to her sister, "Michael was telling me about the grandchildren we never had." The painful simplicity of that phrase made Helen sink heavily into a nearby chair. "Alice, do you remember what we talked about yesterday? About the past?" Alice frowned, concentrating. "You mean about the calls? About you stopping Michael from talking to me?" Helen nodded, relieved to find her sister's memory clear that day. "I've already forgiven you, Helen. I can't waste the days I have left carrying anger." "But how can you forgive so easily? I destroyed your chance at happiness." Alice looked at Michael, who had closed the letter and was watching their conversation intently. "Helen, do you think I haven't been happy in my life?" The question caught Helen off guard. "Well, you always seemed a little melancholic. As if you were waiting for something." "I was waiting," Alice admitted. "But while I waited, I lived. I worked at the library for 40 years, helped hundreds of children discover the love of books. I traveled a few times, made friends, took care of our parents when they got sick. It wasn't the life I dreamed of, but it was a good life." Michael took Alice's hand. "And now? Now I have you back, even if it's for a short time. I have the letters you wrote. I have your daily visits. I have the certainty that you never stopped loving me. It's more than many people have in their entire lives." Helen felt tears well up in her eyes. Her sister's wisdom and generosity shamed and inspired her at the same time. "Michael," Alice said suddenly, "did you bring that special little thing you showed me yesterday?" Michael smiled and took the small blue velvet case from his pocket. "You want to see it again?" "I do." He opened the case, revealing a simple but elegant ring with a small diamond that caught the afternoon light. "I bought it in 1973, 3 days before I left for Charleston. I plan to ask you to marry me when I came back." Alice looked at the ring with admiration. "It's beautiful. Exactly what I would have chosen." "Alice," Michael said, his voice trembling slightly, "I know our situation is complicated. I know the future is uncertain, but I'd like to ask you something." Helen realized what was about to happen and felt her heart race. Michael knelt before Alice's chair, holding the open case. "Alice, will you marry me?" The silence that followed seemed eternal. Other residents strolling on the porch discreetly stopped to observe the scene, as did some staff members. "Michael," Alice said slowly, "I have dementia. I don't know how many good days I have left. I can't promise you a normal marriage." "I don't want a normal marriage," Michael replied. "I want a marriage with you. I want to wake up every day knowing I'm your husband, even if some days you don't remember me. I want to take care of you, be by your side, love you officially for the years we have left." Alice looked at Helen. "What do you think, sister?" Helen wiped her tears and smiled. "I think you two have waited 50 years. You shouldn't wait another day." "Then yes," Alice said, extending her left hand. "Yes, Michael, I accept to marry you." Michael slid the ring onto her finger with trembling hands. It was a little large. After all, it had been bought for a 22-year-old, but it stayed in place, shining like a promise finally fulfilled. Spontaneous applause erupted on the porch. Staff, residents, and visitors had stopped to witness that extraordinary moment. Sister Lucia came running, alerted by the noise, and stopped abruptly, comprehending what was happening. "My goodness," the nun whispered, hand to her chest. "An engagement right here on the porch." "Actually," Michael said, standing and gently kissing Alice's forehead, "I'd like it to be more than just an engagement. Sister Lucia, can you help us organize a wedding?" Helen looked at her sister, who was smiling like a young bride, and then at Michael, whose eyes shone with a happiness she hadn't seen in decades. "A wedding," Helen murmured, Alice is getting married. Alice laughed, a clear sound that echoed across the porch. Yes, Helen, I'm finally marrying the man I love. The news of the engagement spread through Maplewood assisted living like wildfire. Within hours, the entire community, residents, staff, family members, and even suppliers, had been caught up in the festive energy that took over the place. Helen found herself in the center of a whirlwind of activity she had never imagined possible. Mrs. Henderson, an 85-year-old widow who lived in the room next to Alice's, appointed herself the official event planner. "My dear," she said, grabbing Helen's arm, "I can't allow this ceremony to be anything less than perfect. Alice deserves a princess wedding, even if it's here in the garden." "Mrs. Henderson, I don't know if we have the time or resources for—" "Time, resources." The elderly woman laughed with surprising vigor. "Honey, I've organized 7 of my grandchildren's weddings. I know exactly what to do." And she certainly did. In 2 days, Mrs. Henderson had mobilized an impressive network of contacts. Her grandson, a florist, offered the flowers at cost. A former neighbor who was a seamstress offered to alter a dress. And a retired priest who regularly visited Maplewood offered to officiate the ceremony. Michael, for his part, had contacted his children in Charleston. Helen was nervous about this part. How would they react to learning their father, at 74, intended to marry a woman with dementia? "They want to come to the wedding," Michael announced on Thursday morning, beaming. "Charles, my oldest son, said he's always wanted to meet the woman who stole his father's heart even before he was born. And your daughter-in-law? She doesn't think it's strange. Anna is a nurse. She understands better than anyone how love can be therapeutic. In fact, she's bringing our youngest granddaughter, Sophie, who's 6, to be the flower girl." Helen felt a wave of emotion. Michael's family was embracing Alice without even knowing her. It was the kind of acceptance and affection her sister had always deserved. "And about Alice?" Michael asked hesitantly. "How is she handling all the preparations?" "Better than I expected," Helen admitted. "Yesterday she had a very lucid day and helped Mrs. Henderson choose the flower colors. She said she wanted white daisies and pink roses because those were the colors she wore in her hair when you two first met." Michael smiled, clearly touched. She remembers that. Apparently, memories related to you are well preserved. It's as if that part of her brain is protected by something special. In fact, Helen had spoken at length with Alice's doctor about the phenomenon. Dr. Henry explained that it wasn't uncommon for dementia patients to retain vivid, certain memories charged with strong emotional content. "Love is a powerful force," the doctor had said. "Sometimes it can cross barriers that medicine still doesn't fully understand." That afternoon, Helen found Alice in her room, looking thoughtfully out the window. Her sister was wearing the blue dress Helen had brought, the same one she had worn on her first date with Michael at the library 5 decades ago. "How are you feeling, dear?" Alice turned and Helen was surprised to see tears in her eyes. "Helen, I need to ask you a difficult question." "Of course." "Go ahead. What happens to me after the wedding? I mean, regarding my condition. Will Michael want to take me to live with him?" Helen sat on the bed beside her sister. "Have you two talked about this?" "We've talked a little, but I think he's being overly optimistic. Helen, I know I'm going to get worse. I know there will come a day when I won't recognize him, when I might become aggressive or frightened." "How is that going to work?" The painful lucidity of the question made Helen swallow hard. "Alice, Michael knows about your condition. He cared for his own wife when she had Alzheimer's. He understands what's ahead. But is that fair to him? After waiting 50 years, does he deserve to have to care for a sick wife?" Helen held her sister's hands. "Alice, you once asked me if I thought you hadn't been happy in life. Now I ask you, do you think Michael won't be happy caring for you? Alice considered the question carefully. I think he's already decided he'd prefer any time with me, even if it's difficult, to more time without me. Exactly. And you? Do you prefer to protect him by staying away, or do you prefer to enjoy every good moment you can have together? I want to enjoy every moment, Alice admitted. Even the difficult ones. They were interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. It was Sister Lucia carrying a small box. Mrs. Anderson, I've brought a surprise for you. What kind of surprise? The nun opened the box, revealing a delicate wedding veil, clearly old but very well preserved. It belonged to my sister, who passed away 10 years ago. She always said she wanted another bride to wear it when the time came. Alice was speechless, delicately touching the fine fabric. It's beautiful, Sister Lucia, but I can't accept something so special. Of course you can. My sister would be happy knowing it's being used in a wedding for true love. Helen helped Alice try on the veil. Even at 70, with white hair and wrinkles that told the story of a life lived, her sister was radiant. The veil framed her face in a way that made her look young and full of dreams again. How do I look? Alice asked. Beautiful, Helen answered sincerely. The most beautiful bride I've ever seen. Alice looked at herself in the small mirror in the room and smiled. At 70, I'm finally marrying the love of my life. And how do you feel about it? Scared, happy, grateful, anxious? Alice laughed. I guess I feel exactly how any bride feels before the wedding. Helen hugged her sister, feeling a mix of joy and melancholy. Alice, can I ask you something now? Of course. Do you really forgive me? Completely? Alice pulled back and looked directly into Helen's eyes. Helen, you've spent 50 years taking care of me, protecting me, being my best friend. One mistake you made when we were young can't erase an entire life of love and dedication. But if I hadn't interfered, if you hadn't interfered, maybe Michael and I would have married young, had children, grown old together. Or maybe we would have separated for other reasons. Maybe he would have accepted that job abroad he mentioned. Maybe I would have died in childbirth. Like our cousin Rose, life has its own plans. Helen, do you really believe that? Alice took Helen's hands and squeezed them tightly. I believe that Michael and I are together now because it was meant to be. At 70, with all the wisdom we've accumulated, with all the gratitude for the days we have left. Maybe this is the perfect time for our love. Helen felt a peace she hadn't experienced in weeks settle in her heart. Her sister wasn't just forgiving the past, she was finding meaning and beauty in the present, even with all its limitations. Then, Helen said, smiling through her tears, let's prepare an unforgettable wedding. The wedding day dawned with a perfect blue sky, without a single cloud. Helen woke up early at Maplewood, where she had spent the night in the guest room, and immediately went to check on Alice. She found her sister awake, sitting in bed, staring at her own hands. Helen's heart sank. It was a sign she knew well. On difficult days, Alice often woke up confused, not knowing where she was or who she was. Good morning, dear, Helen said softly, approaching slowly. How are you feeling? Alice looked up, and Helen saw a fog in her eyes that hadn't been present in recent days. Helen, where are we? Why am I not in my own bed? Helen's stomach churned. Of all possible days, why today was Alice having an episode of confusion? We're at Maplewood Assisted Living, remember? You live here now. Assisted living, Alice frowned. But I'm not old enough for assisted living. I'm only, how old am I? Helen carefully sat on the edge of the bed. You're 70, Alice. And today is a very special day. Special how? It's your wedding day. Alice blinked several times, as if trying to process the information. My wedding? But to whom? Helen felt tears begin to well up in her eyes. To Michael, remember. Michael Anderson, the man you love. Michael. Alice repeated the name slowly, as if tasting a new word. I don't remember any Michael. At that moment, Helen heard footsteps in the hallway and voices approaching. It was Michael's children, who had arrived early to help with the final preparations. In a few hours, over 50 people would be gathered in the Maplewood garden to witness a wedding, and the bride didn't remember the groom. Alice, Helen said, struggling to keep her voice calm, I'm going to show you something, all right? She picked up one of Michael's letters from the nightstand and began to read. My dearest Alice, today I walked along the beach thinking of you. As I do every day, the ocean was calm, and I imagined how beautiful it would be if we could walk together on the sand. As Helen read, she carefully watched Alice's face. Slowly, very slowly, something began to change in her expression. It was like watching a photograph gradually developing. Because you're the only woman who has ever made my heart sing like a bird at dawn, Helen continued. Bird at dawn, Alice murmured. He always said that. Helen felt a spark of hope. Yes, he always said that. Are you remembering? Alice closed her eyes, concentrating intensely. Michael. Michael, with the kind eyes. Michael who worked at the port. Michael who promised to come back for me. That's right. And he came back, Alice. He finally came back. Alice's eyes opened suddenly, now shining with recognition. He came back? Michael really came back. Yes. And today you two are getting married. Alice brought her hands to her face, emotional. I've dreamed of this day for so many years. But Helen, look at me. I'm old. I have wrinkles. My hair is white. Will he still find me beautiful? Helen smiled, relieved to see her sister fully present again. Alice, when Michael sees you, he still sees the 22-year-old he met at the library. You are beautiful. Yesterday, today, and always. A gentle knock on the door interrupted the moment. It was Sister Lucia, carrying a tray with breakfast. How is our bride? The nun asked cheerfully. Nervous, Alice admitted. What if I forget the vows? What if I can't speak during the ceremony? Mrs. Anderson, Sister Lucia said, placing the tray on the table. Father Thomas said he can perform a simple ceremony. You just need to say, I do, at the right time. What if I forget to say, I do? Helen laughed, taking her sister's hands. Alice, you've waited 50 years to say that, I do. I'm sure you won't forget. The next 2 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Mrs. Henderson arrived with a team of volunteers to help Alice get ready. The light blue dress they had chosen looked perfect. Sister Lucia's veil completed the look with elegance. And even a volunteer makeup artist appeared to add the finishing touches. When everything was ready, Helen spent a few minutes alone with Alice in the room. How are you feeling now? Scared and happy at the same time, Alice admitted. Helen, can I ask you something? Anything. If during the ceremony I become confused, if I forget where I am or what's happening, will you remind me that I'm marrying the man I love? Helen hugged her sister. Feeling the full weight and responsibility of that moment, I promise I'll be right by your side the whole time. And Helen, yes. Thank you for bringing Michael back to me. I know it must have been hard for you, carrying that weight for so long. Thank you for forgiving me. We're sisters, Alice said simply. That's what sisters do. They look out for each other, even when they make mistakes. Sister Lucia, appeared at the door. "It's time. Mr. Anderson is in the garden, and all the guests have arrived." Helen offered her arm to Alice. "Ready?" Alice took a deep breath, adjusted her veil, and smiled. "Ready? At 70, I'm finally ready to get married." They walked slowly down the corridor towards the garden. Helen could hear soft music playing and low voices of animated conversations. When they reached the door leading to the garden, Alice stopped abruptly. "Helen, is he there? Is Michael really there waiting for me?" Helen looked through the glass door and saw Michael standing before Father Thomas, wearing a navy suit, holding a small bouquet of white daisies. His children were beside him, smiling, and little Sophie wore a pink dress, scattering rose petals on the ground. "Yes, Alice, he's there waiting for you, just like he promised he would 50 years ago." Alice smiled, and at that moment, Helen saw again the radiant young woman her sister had once been. "Then let's go. My groom is waiting." The garden at Maplewood Assisted Living had been transformed into a dreamlike setting. Rows of white chairs were arranged in a semicircle around a small makeshift altar under the shade of the old oak tree. Garlands of white daisies and pink roses decorated each seat, and a carpet of petals marked the path to where Michael waited. Helen felt Alice's arm tremble slightly as they appeared at the garden entrance. The guests rose in unison, residents of Maplewood, staff, some curious neighbors, and Michael's family who had traveled especially for the moment. But Alice had eyes only for Michael. He stood before Father Thomas, magnificent in his navy suit, his white hair neatly combed, holding the bouquet of daisies as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. When his eyes met Alice's, his face lit up with a smile that seemed capable of illuminating the entire garden. "He's crying," Alice whispered to Helen. "So are you," Helen replied, delicately wiping a tear from her sister's face. The soft music of a guitar, played by Jack, Mrs. Henderson's grandson, accompanied the two sisters' slow steps down the petal-strewn aisle. Helen observed the faces of the guests as they passed. Some were visibly moved, others smiled tenderly, but all seemed to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. When they reached the altar, Michael took a step forward. "Thank you," he said quietly to Helen, "for bringing me the love of my life." Helen kissed Alice's forehead and whispered, "Be happy, my sister." Then carefully she placed Alice's hand in Michael's. The simple touch seemed to create an electric current between them. Michael offered the bouquet to Alice, and she accepted it with hands that no longer trembled. "Are you ready?" Father Thomas asked with a warm smile. "We've waited 50 years for this moment," Michael replied. "We are more than ready." The priest began the ceremony with simple but profound words about love that transcends time and circumstances. Helen watched as Alice remained focused and present, as if the very strength of her happiness was keeping mental confusion at bay. "Michael," the priest said, "do you take Alice to be your wife, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, in joy and in sorrow, for as long as God grants you?" "I do," Michael replied with a firm voice, looking directly into Alice's eyes. "I do with all my heart, with all my soul, with all the gratitude for the days we had apart and for the days we will have together." "Alice," the priest continued, "do you take Michael to be your husband, to love him and be by his side, in joys and in difficulties, for as long as you are granted?" Alice looked at Michael, then at Helen, then at all the smiling faces around them. For a terrible moment, Helen saw a shadow of confusion cross her sister's eyes. Alice hesitated, and the garden fell into absolute silence. Michael gently squeezed her hand. "It's all right, my love. You're here, I'm here, and that's all that matters." His voice seemed to anchor her again. Alice smiled. That radiant smile Helen hadn't seen in years. "I do," she said, clearly and decisively. "Michael Anderson, I do take you to be my husband today, tomorrow, and for all the days we have. I do, because you are the man I have always loved, the man who waited for me, the man who came for me exactly as he promised." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. Even Father Thomas himself had to pause a moment to compose himself. "The rings," he said finally. "Charles." Michael's oldest son approached carrying 2 simple gold bands Michael had bought the day before. They weren't elaborate, but they shone with the promise of a love finally made official. Michael slid the ring onto Alice's finger with hands trembling with emotion. "With this ring, I give you my heart, my life, my eternal love." Alice took Michael's ring and, with a precision that surprised everyone, placed it on his finger. "With this ring, I give you all that I am, all that I have, all the love I have saved for you throughout all these years. By the power vested in me," Father Thomas declared, his voice heavy with emotion, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Michael, you may kiss your wife." Michael held Alice's face delicately between his hands and kissed her with infinite tenderness. It was a soft, respectful kiss, but laden with 5 decades of longing and love. The garden erupted in applause, cheers, and tears of joy. Rose petals flew through the air as guests tossed them over the newlywed couple. Helen watched her sister, now Alice Anderson, radiant in the arms of the man she had always loved. "We did it," Alice whispered into Michael's ear. "We finally did it." "Yes, my love, we're finally husband and wife." The celebration that followed was simple but perfect. Tables had been set up in the garden with a modest cake decorated with real daisies. Delicate sandwiches prepared by the Maplewood kitchen, and a mild punch that even the diabetic residents could enjoy. Helen observed how Michael didn't leave Alice's side for a moment. When she got tired, he helped her sit down. When she seemed confused by so many new people, he whispered explanations in her ear. When she smiled, he smiled too, as if her happiness was the source of his own light. "Mrs. Carter," Charles said, approaching her during the party, "thank you for making this possible. I've never seen my father so happy. Thank you for accepting Alice into your family. It means everything to her and to me." Mrs. Anderson is exactly as my father always described her, sweet, intelligent, and with a smile that illuminates everything around her. Helen watched Michael showing Alice photographs of his grandchildren on his phone, explaining who each one was. Alice listened attentively, asking questions, genuinely interested in the family she had just gained. As the sun began to set, painting the garden with golden hues, Michael stood up and asked for everyone's attention. "I'd like to say a few words," he announced, still holding Alice's hand. "Today is not just the day I married the woman I love. It's the day I learned that it's never too late for dreams to come true, that true love can wait decades and still remain strong, and that some promises take a lifetime to fulfill, but they are worth every day of waiting." He looked at Helen. "Thank you for giving me back my soulmate." Then he looked at Alice. "And thank you, my wife, for waiting for me, for never giving up on us." Alice stood with his help and, to everyone's surprise, spoke in a clear, strong voice. "Michael taught me that true love is never in a hurry. It waits, it forgives, it finds a way. Today, at 70, I can say it was worth waiting for this extraordinary man." The final applause echoed through the garden as the couple kissed again, now as husband and wife, their rings shining in the golden light of the sunset. Helen smiled through her tears, knowing she had witnessed something truly magical, the triumph of love over time, over circumstances, and over all the obstacles life had placed in their path. 3 months had passed since the wedding, and Helen watched from the living room window as Michael tended the garden of the house he now shared with Alice. After long conversations with the doctors and the administration of Maplewood Assisted Living, they had decided that Alice would be better in a family environment, with specialized daytime care and Michael's love around the clock. The routine they developed was simple, but full of meaning. Every morning, Michael helped Alice get dressed and comb her hair. Then they would have coffee together on the porch, where he would read the old letters to her, a tradition that had become sacred between them. On good days, Alice remembered every word. On difficult days, she simply let herself be enveloped by her husband's loving voice. "How is she today?" Helen asked when Michael greeted her at the door. "She had a wonderful morning," he replied, smiling. "She helped me choose which flowers to plant for spring. She said she wants white daisies and pink roses, just like at our wedding." Helen entered the house that in just 3 months had been transformed into the true home Alice had always deserved. Family photographs decorated the walls, some old ones of Michael with his children, others recent ones of the couple, and several from the wedding that Mrs. Henderson had made sure to print and frame. "Alice is on the porch," Michael said. "She's eager to see you." Helen found her sister sitting in the rocking chair Michael had bought especially for her, watching the birds visiting the feeder he had installed. Alice was wearing the blue cardigan that had always been her favorite, and her wedding ring gleamed on her hand. "Hi, dear," Helen said, kissing her sister's forehead. "Helen, so glad you came." Alice smiled, and Helen was relieved to see that today was one of the good days. "Michael stepped out to water the plants, but he'll be right back. He doesn't like to leave me alone for too long." "And how are you feeling?" "Happy," Alice replied without hesitation. "Every day I wake up happy, Helen. Even on days when I'm confused, when Michael explains that we're married, that he's my husband, I feel a deep joy right here." She touched her chest. "It's as if my heart always knew the truth, even when my mind gets lost." Helen sat in the chair next to her sister. In recent weeks, she had noticed a change in herself. The weight of the guilt she had carried for months was gradually giving way to something different, a peace that came from knowing she had done what she could to mend the past. "Alice, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "I've been thinking a lot about our lives, about the choices we made, about what it truly means to care for someone we love." Alice stopped rocking and gave her sister her full attention. "For years, I thought protecting you meant making decisions for you, preventing you from getting hurt, keeping you safe, even if it meant keeping you limited. But Michael taught me that loving someone means trusting them to make their own choices, even when those choices involve risks." "And what else did he teach you?" Helen smiled. "And that it's never too late to correct our mistakes, that true love is patient enough to wait decades for a second chance, and that sometimes the greatest demonstration of love is to let people be happy on their own terms, not the way we think they should be." Alice reached out and held Helen's hand. "You've always been a wonderful sister, Helen. What happened in the past brought us here to this moment, and this moment is perfect." Michael appeared on the porch, carrying a watering can and with dirt on his hands. "How are my 2 favorite girls doing?" "Just talking about life," Alice replied, reaching out for him to come closer. Michael quickly washed up at the outdoor sink and joined them on the porch. Helen watched as he automatically checked if Alice was comfortable, if she needed water, if she was cold. They were small gestures, but full of love and attention. "Michael," Helen said, "may I ask a personal question?" "Of course." "Do you have any regrets? Any moments where you think, what if things had been different?" Michael considered the question carefully. "Of course. Sometimes I think about what could have been. I imagine what it would have been like to have had children with Alice, to have grown old with her from a young age. But then I look at her now, I see how every line on her face tells a story of kindness and strength. I see how she faced life alone and became this extraordinary woman, and I think that maybe we needed to go through all of that to become the people we are today. And you, Alice, Helen asked. I learned an important thing in the last few months, Alice said slowly. Happiness isn't about having a perfect life, it's about finding perfect moments within an imperfect life. And these last few months with Michael have been full of those perfect moments. They remained in silence for a few minutes, watching the garden where butterflies danced among the flowers. Helen felt a sense of completeness she hadn't experienced in years. Her family was finally at peace. Helen, Michael said suddenly, Mr. Hayes called me yesterday. He said there are other cases like ours, people who got lost in the past and could be reunited. He asked if you'd like to help. Help how? He's thinking of creating a project to bring together people who got lost due to misunderstandings or life circumstances, separated families, lost friends, interrupted loves. He said you have a special knack for understanding and connecting people. Helen was surprised by the proposal. Do you think I should accept? I think you have a second chance to use your experience to help other people find their happiness, Alice said. It would be a beautiful way to transform our story into something that can benefit others. And it would be a way to honor what we've learned, Michael added. That love always finds a way, but sometimes it needs a little help. Helen smiled, feeling a new energy ignite within her. You know what? I think I'd really like to do that. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. Helen watched Michael help Alice stand from the rocking chair, and the two walked slowly towards the house, hand in hand, talking softly. Her sister was safe, loved and happy. Michael had found the completeness he had sought for 5 decades, and she, Helen, had learned that sometimes the greatest gifts we can give each other arise from our courage to admit our mistakes and our determination to correct them. As she drove home, Helen thought about the phone call she would make to Mr. Hayes the next morning. There were stories waiting to be reunited, families waiting to be reconnected, and loves that needed a second chance. At 72, Helen Carter was ready to begin the most significant chapter of her own life.